Welcome to episode 13 of It's About Data, the podcast about data, analytics, AI, and whatever we feel like talking about that particular week. And this week we are going to be talking about that because this week, episode 13, is on Databricks Summit 2025. It's with your co hosts, Matt Housley, principal of Halfpipe Systems, and Tony Bear of DB Insight. Take it away, Matt.
All right, Tony, welcome to this episode. You recently made a pilgrimage to San Francisco and the Moscone Center for Databricks Summit, or what is it now? It's Data Plus AI Summit as of what, 2023?
Yeah, well, it's been that way for a while, Data and
For a
AI
couple of
Summit
years.
for a
Yeah.
while. But actually, I've been at San Francisco for two consecutive weeks, not
Yeah.
straight, back and forth. It's for the part of the month that now we euphemistically call Snowbricks because Snowflake and Databricks basically are scheduled apart from each other, one week after the next. It kind of avoids the scheduling conflict they had a few years ago, which I think perturbed a few members of the community, including many of their joint customers.
Well, okay. And I think I went to Databricks that year, and a lot of people thought it was a malicious thing. I think Snowflake claimed that it was an accident. What do you think happened there?
No, well, no, I don't know. I really don't want to speculate on
Yeah,
that.
yeah. Okay, that's
I
fair.
will say that I was kind of a back channel with the AR people to make sure they didn't step on each other's programs, me and probably
Yeah.
several others. But I just think that they realized this is not. I'll give an example, which is that I met a joint customer there. Well, actually, I met a bunch of joint customers at both conferences, both events, and they were pretty perturbed about the whole thing. And I think
Yeah.
that's the last thing that either company wants to do.
Yeah, totally makes sense. Okay, here's another question, which invites some speculation, I suppose. Do we still have this sense of like very much a head to head Snowflake versus Databricks, or does it feel like they're pursuing somewhat different markets now? Because again, that year, it definitely felt very head to head.
I think it's still very much head to head.
Okay.
There's no question about that. I mean, like Ali made an interesting crack about a new Databricks, I guess, compute feature, and then sort of kind of satirized, Snowflake. Snowflake basically announced their Gen 2 data warehouse, which is at a 35% premium, but what they claim was 2x better compute. So,
Right.
Ali, parodied that. And the fact, the reality is they are both trying to move into each other's markets and take a look at
Yes.
essentially kind of like almost it seemed like the tit for tat, database acquisitions that both have made. They both have acquired Postgres companies for relatively similar purposes.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, Databricks, their acquisition was much more longer in the planning. They had jointly invested in Neon for several years and had been working with them. Snowflake essentially made their acquisition of Crunchy Data. That was, from what I understand, a pretty quick transaction. It transpired very quickly. I think what's matter there, as we mentioned during our Snowflake podcast, that the CEO wants to get product out and like, let's not keep wasting, spinning our wheels on Unistore. Let's just solve this problem. But anyway,
Yeah.
this is about Databricks today.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Snowflake will be in the background the whole
Yes.
time. But yeah, let's talk about the big announcements. You already mentioned one of those, which was the Neon acquisition.
Well, let me take this a step back, which is that I think one of the interesting things is that number one, at almost every conference, AI is going to be the headliner, and this year,
Yeah.
agents are going to be the headliner. And
Yes.
it was kind of interesting that the headline here this year was headlines are more about data. It's not that saying that Databricks is basically all of a sudden AI is done or anything like that. I think part of it is that this whole rush to agentic. Well, Databricks was kind of ahead of the curve last year in
Yeah.
announcing a developer framework before anybody else. So they did not have to do a whole big coming out party for that this year like Google did or IBM did.
Yes.
So I think that's certainly part of it. And they did announce make a fairly important announcement in Agents, which we'll get to. But it was interesting how data was the headliner of the show. It started with the Neon acquisition. Now, Ali basically is very grand in basically his pronouncements about what this can be. My own take on it, and I think it's the same for both. Is this is really a very niche play for both of them? That
Hmm.
it is filling in a check mark, and it could be said that Databricks' acquisition of Neon was more well thought out, but I think Snowflake, in terms of the money spent, might have gotten a better value only because for only one reason alone, which is that they probably spent a fraction on crunchy data of the reported 1 billion that Dataflix spent on Neon. But
Interesting. Do you think
yeah,
this was an acquisition under distress with crunchy data, or maybe not distress, but like, hey, let's just get this done because the market is not getting any better with interest rates and everything?
well, I think both basically want to fill out. I mean, well, with Databricks, it was much longer in planning.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
I think Snowflake was a matter of we announced Unistore 3 years ago, and everybody's wondering what's happened with it.
yeah. That's fair.
And I think this was just let's just settle that matter. In
Yeah,
terms of what this is for, now they both will say we're this is for transaction databases. It's in other words, it's the other half of the equation, the other side of the
right.
coin. Realistically, and I think they both will admit that they're not about to displace Oracle tomorrow or SQL Server tomorrow or any of that type of thing. It's really I see it. I mean, obviously, Ali says this is for the new the new architecture, and we're going to reimagine it for cloud and AI. And there's certainly some validity to that, but I don't see anybody dropping their OLTP database to all of a sudden rush into this new architecture. The thing is
Yeah,
that
agreed.
companies run their businesses on this, and it takes time. I mean, just like it's taken time for Databricks to build up its SQL for analytics and data
Yeah,
warehousing, it's going to take time to really to match the transaction functionality, the deep transaction functionality that you get in something like an Oracle. That being said, where I really do see this fitting in more is really I would say like edge cases. One is that it's a dev platform, um,
agree.
and it's also that and that's very much in conjunction with agentic, where like agents may be spinning up basically ephemeral data stores. So I think that's certainly so if you're going to be spinning up a data store, it may as well be Postgres because that's a reasonably standard data store.
Standard and very stable, very mature.
Exactly, and one that also is very mutable. Now you can do with
Yes.
it what you want with it. As a matter of fact, I just spoke. I just had breakfast yesterday with a company that's now being called oh gosh, uh, Tiger Scale,
Tiger
the,
scale.
the
Okay.
Vorman Time Scale, and they've been working on their own variant of Postgres for years, and they actually have some pretty interesting plans, which we'll talk about later in the summer. But back to our the core point, part of it's for the agentic. I think there's also part of it might be for certain edge cases where you want some real time operational inline analytics. So I could see that fitting into the profile for both companies.
Yeah. Well, and going back to Unistore, which is very related to what Databricks is doing here, the way I heard it pitched when they were talking about it is like, hey, if you're a web dev and you're developing a web app or a service, you can now immediately have analytics on top of that. Instead of going to RDS, just go with us, and then you'll have immediately this analytics connection. Now, to your point, some
Right.
maturation will be required before this handles really heavy critical workloads, but who knows? Like maybe both companies will get their Postgres offerings so mature that they are legit competitors to RDS and other options out there by the cloud providers.
I think that would be, but I think that would basically be distraction for both companies to really
Could
go
be.
at that as a
Yeah.
prime market.
Yeah.
It just, I mean, there is some rationalization to say like, this is if you take the whole idea of basically of simplifying or collapsing the modern data
Yeah.
stack. Why don't we? But then again, that gets into the issue of do you really want hybrid transaction and analytic database? And of course, we can then come up with the argument that in the cloud. You can have common storage and separate engines and workload isolations.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
another discussion for another day. There's some other interesting data announcements. One is that 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 Iceberg in for Databricks is now a first class citizen along with Delta Lake. It has, I would say, about 98% of the functionality of what Databricks has with Delta Lake, and in time that will be there. It will basically level out. There are some minor differences. For instance, that Delta Lake only supports Parquet, and Iceberg supports several other formats
Mm-hmm.
such as ORC. That's kind of an asterisk there, but
Right, but everyone uses Parquet, right? Like Parquet is so dominant.
yeah,
Unless you have a legacy reason to use Orc, then you're probably using Parquet.
exactly. It was an interesting sort of fitting cap to the saga
Yeah,
of the surprise acquisition of Tabular last year. And I kind of affirmed, as mentioned, I think in our first, podcast of the series, that Ali Ghodsi is actually he's competitive, he's pragmatic, and he thought
Yeah,
like, why fight a format over, why fight a war over table formats? There's just
exactly.
bigger fish to fry.
Yeah,
Um, with this, of course, there's the growing sort of reach of Unity catalog. Now, of course, we saw the same thing with at Snowflake with with Horizon, being able to reach out and reach into, start to govern some unmanaged tables, and you start to see kind of a similar sort of dynamic, come to play with Unity, and that just underscores sort of my take, which is that in the lake house, I think a key battleground is going to be in the governance and the ownership of that data, and that's really centered in the
yeah.
data catalog.
I agree. I agree. And there's kind of an irony here. Now that they've acquired Tabular, we're finally seeing more third-party adoption of the Delta catalog, which is kind of
Yeah,
like that's exciting, right? The Unity catalog. Like
yeah.
2 years ago, I would have told you, well, it's technically Delta is open source, but not many other people are using it. Now we're finally seeing that expansion, the open source Unity catalog. It's interesting.
Yeah, I think that's really the value add. And as I said,
Yeah.
Ali was very shrewd to basically see that and not look at
Mm-hmm.
this as being an ego battle,
And not
or
fight the community. Just get, the more the merrier,
just
basically.
just get on with it.
Yeah.
Just get on
Yep.
with it.
Yeah.
Um, so there were also, so that was one part of this. I mean, the whole data area, and there's some interesting stuff with Unity Catalog. They're adding something called Unity Catalog measures, which is kind of
Mm-hmm.
like for KPIs. It's kind of like the equivalent of what a feature store is for features in AI. Now, what's
Mm-hmm.
the idea is so that when we're talking customer or talking about, let's say, uh, some sort of business KPI, which is like sales, in a region, that we all are speaking the same language, that they're all the same construct. And the thing
Yeah.
is, that's an issue that's an eternal issue in enterprises,
Always.
going way back.
Yep. Yep.
Um, what I've kind of put through in my wish list is like, guys, and gals, um, why don't you follow it up with a knowledge catalog, which essentially shows that what these metrics really are, just beyond
Yeah.
essentially like a business glossary type of thing. And that's something which a number of their rivals have really, that have gotten higher up in the semantic layer, have really started to look at. And I mean, so that's something which I would like to see data. That's on my wish list for Databricks.
Yeah.
Another interesting theme, and again, we'll get to AI later, but it's interesting how I think it's just we with Databricks, we just see AI as part of the background there. It's not, it's not notable. It's like it's part of the definition of who they are as a company.
Yeah.
But the next area, which I thought was really kind of a departure for them, is where I'm saying that they're really trying to start to press the easy button, because when you look
Yes.
at Databricks tooling, the interface, the user experiences, it's very geeky. And why? It's because it's been aimed at, say, Python developers.
Well, and from my perspective, and I say this as a math PhD, part of their problem was an internal cultural problem because who do they hire at Databricks? A lot of PhDs who like to geek out on stuff versus like product and sales people who are just
Mm-hmm.
like, no, make it work, make it easy. And it seems like that is finally starting to shift.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Yeah, well, it also makes sense in terms of for where they were as product, because
It does.
essentially,
Yeah.
originally as a Spark company,
Mm-hmm.
Spark was not going to be used by business analysts. It was used by data engineers,
Right.
and the biggest workload to date, with the Spark is data engineering. And then, as I said, ML Flow is like the next step in the transformation of Databricks to becoming to spreading its wings more towards AI.
Yeah.
Um, and then, of course, Delta Lake basically then gave it the underlying data platform,
Yeah.
essentially. Um,
Data warehousing, basically, like classic enterprise data, like
yes,
core business analytics.
yes,
Yeah.
yes, exactly. Um, and so a number of things. One is basically Databricks. A lot of, well, first off, let's start with the user experience, which is
Yeah.
Databricks One, which is now being applied to their AI BI piece. Eventually, they want to spread that across the portfolio. We'll see how well that maps to some of the more technical functions. But on
Yeah.
the other hand, with Genie, which is kind of like the natural language, the conversational front end, and the Copilot, it's conceivable that basically that some of these more technical tasks could be turned into a conversational experience. So
Yeah.
that's an area to watch. But along with that, we saw things like Lakeflow Designer, which is basically, kind of like point and click for designing data transformations. Lakeflow for Connect for integrations. So there are a whole number of pieces that were just introduced this year. It was really designed to simplify the user experience and make Databricks look less like Databricks. So I thought
Yeah.
that was an interesting point.
Yeah, more like, frankly, Snowflake, right? Simple deployment, point and click, spin up warehouse, serverless. They're pushing serverless very, very hard,
Right.
meaning don't worry about the cluster. We'll take care of that. Just tell us what you want to do, and we'll charge you based on what you did.
And the two companies still have their debates there. Snowflake will say,
Yeah,
"Is Databricks really serverless?" And we're going to be keep seeing those
yeah.
debates.
But it's simplicity, right? That's the main thing. Who
Right,
cares if it's serverless or not? If it's simple for the user,
right.
that's what people care about.
I'll get to the last piece.
Yeah,
As I said, there were a number of basically sort of enhancements with AI. A good example being now they're introducing serverless GPUs. I'm not going to get into the minutia there. I think
yeah,
the highlight there is agent bricks. And keep in mind, while everybody else was introducing their agent frameworks this year, Databricks for them, it's been there, done that, and so they're taking the next step, which is basically a piece essentially, which helps you sort of look at the kind of like it's kind of like a development environment for agents.
mm-hmm,
Now Google
mm-hmm.
has some of that already, but also they're doing some interesting optimizations. And part of which is kind of a check. They're using language models to check the performance of language models,
Yeah,
kind
yep.
of an adversarial, kind of like an adversarial type of
Kind of like
evaluation.
GANs. You remember GANs a couple of years ago?
Exactly,
Yeah,
generative adversarial networks.
exactly.
So there's some very similar principles there. It's kind of funny because with the name Agent Bricks, I keep thinking like it's some secret agent. So a bunch of guys named Bricks, because this is a guy's name. Sorry about that. And then if they ever get promoted, it's Sergeant Bricks. It's just I don't know why I keep thinking that, but it just kept occurring in my head.
There are a bunch of memes on Instagram and other places along
Yeah,
these lines, like Agent
exactly.
Smith from The Matrix, right? Old movie
Yeah.
reference.
I think the broad takeaway is really more, as I said, this year it didn't have the shock value of last year.
Yeah,
Not that it need to have it. I mean, last year the shock value was one tabular acquisition, and then essentially being the firing the first shot on an agentic framework. So that was, I mean, this year it was more about expanding the reach and
yeah,
serving previously, addressing audiences that Databricks has traditionally not addressed, and of course expanding the tentacles, if you will, the reach
yeah.
of Unity Catalog, which actually it's not unique among Databricks. Everybody is trying to expand the reach through their catalogs.
Yeah. And again, the realization that making it more open and getting more adopters actually works in your favor in this respect versus calling it
Exactly.
open source, but mostly keeping it in house. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. There are a whole bunch of other things. I know we've really
Yeah.
not done justice to everything, but those are really the headlines that I really saw from this year.
Okay, so I want to close this episode out by talking about stuff that actually didn't come from Data Plus AI Summit, and that is a couple of remarks from Ali Ghodsi, basically indicating that he is an AI realist. And so
Yes.
I don't know if you saw these remarks in Business Insider, but basically he said, people underestimate how hard it is going to be to completely automate tasks, referring to agents. I'm sure that Databricks marketing just freaked out when he said that, but he's like, it's going to be useful, but you need to supervise everything that it
Yeah, I
does.
mean, put it this way. I mean, well, he was actually also very frank, with us, and
Yeah.
actually, even on the keynote stage, even when
Mm-hmm.
he was on the record, saying, "Look, don't." He is not Sam Altman. He's not
Right.
talking AGI. He's saying,
Right.
"Look, we need to basically we need to frame this properly and frame our expectations." So, actually, for someone who's normally very expansive in his
Yeah.
claims, very realistic with
Yeah.
regard to AI, and kind of refreshingly so.
Yeah, and a month ago, beginning of May, he also said at a conference in San Francisco, "Hey, the AI bubble is going to pop," which is kind of a remarkable thing for a
Yeah.
CEO to say when they're riding this AI wave. And he's like, "It's useful, it's exciting, but it's also very frothy, and it's not going to last forever." So, I'll be very curious to see if he's right. I generally agree with him on these remarks.
Well, we'll continue this conversation.
We will. Many more conversations to come. Okay,
Sounds
fantastic.
good.
Well, I hope I get to join you next year, and we'll have this episode up soon, and we'll post some other upcoming topics too.
Sounds like a plan.
All right, take care, Tony.
See you.